What if I told you that the greatest songwriter of the 20th century deliberately sabotaged the most successful band in history because he couldn't stand sharing the spotlight? From I Want to Hold Your Hand to Let It Be, the Beatles revolutionized music, culture, and an entire generation. Four lads from Liverpool became gods. But behind the harmonies, the screaming fans, and the cultural revolution, one man's ego was quietly dismantling everything they'd built. John Lennon, the sharp-tongued genius, the working-class hero, the peace advocate, wasn't just a Beatle. He was the Beatle. At least, that's what he believed. And that belief, that unshakable conviction that he deserved more credit, more attention, more control, would ultimately tear apart the greatest creative partnership in music history. But how does someone destroy something they helped create? To understand that, we need to go back to 1957 to a church garden party in Liverpool, where a cocky 16-year-old met a baby-faced 15-year-old who could tune a guitar. July 6, 1957, St. Peter's Church Garden Fete, Woolton, Liverpool. John Lennon, already leading his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, was performing when he first locked eyes with Paul McCartney. What happened next would change music forever. Paul, not content to just watch, picked up a guitar and showed John how to properly tune it, then proceeded to play Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock flawlessly, complete with all the correct lyrics. For most teenagers, this would be impressive. For John Lennon, it was threatening. See, John had built his identity on being the leader, the rebel, the one who didn't follow rules, including the rule that you should actually know the correct words to songs you perform. Younger, prettier, and undeniably more skilled, doing everything John did but better. John faced a choice: protect his ego and reject Paul, or swallow his pride and invite someone more talented into his band. His close friend Pete Shotton later recalled, "I could see it was eating John up inside. He wanted to be the best, but he also wanted the band to be the best. For once, his ambition won over his ego. For once." That decision, that rare moment of humility, created the Lennon-McCartney partnership. Together they wrote I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, A Hard Day's Night, Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Come Together. Between 1962 and 1969, they dominated the charts, won every award, and literally changed the trajectory of popular music. But the dynamic was never equal. John was the edgy one, the intellectual, the artist. Paul's Yesterday became the most covered song in history. He hated that Paul could write a perfect pop song in his sleep. He hated that when people thought of the Beatles' melody, they thought of McCartney. And most of all, he hated that despite being the founder, despite being the rebel, despite being John Lennon, he increasingly felt like he was in Paul's shadow. By 1966, the Beatles had stopped touring. The screaming had become unbearable, the fame suffocating. They retreated to the studio, and for a brief, beautiful moment, they created Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that many consider the greatest ever made. But even here, John felt overshadowed. Paul had conceived the concept. Paul had driven the sessions. Paul's A Day in the Life orchestral crescendo became the album's climax. And while John contributed masterpieces like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was Paul's album. Then in August 1967, their manager Brian Epstein died of an accidental overdose. Epstein had been the buffer, the diplomat, the one person who could manage four massive egos. With him gone, the Beatles needed someone to take control. Paul stepped up, John stepped back. And that decision, or rather John's resentment of that decision, began the countdown to the end. But it wasn't Paul who would deliver the final blow to John's already fragile ego. It was a Japanese avant-garde artist who would walk into Abbey Road Studios and change everything. November 1966. Indica Gallery, London. John Lennon, seeking something beyond Beatlemania, wandered into an avant-garde art exhibition. There, he encountered Yoko Ono's ceiling painting, a piece that required climbing a ladder to view the word yes through a magnifying glass. It was positive. I felt relieved, John later said. It's a great relief when you get up the ladder and you look through the spyglass and it doesn't say no or fuck you or something. It said yes. For John, who had spent years being told what to do, where to go, and how to act, Yoko represented freedom. She didn't care that he was a Beatle. She didn't want him to be a Beatle. She wanted him to be an artist. This should have remained a private matter. A Beatle dating someone was normal. John had been married to Cynthia Lennon since 1962. Paul was with Jane Asher, George with Pattie Boyd. The Beatles had always maintained a boundary between their personal lives and their work. John shattered that boundary. In May 1968, while his wife and son Julian were on holiday, John invited Yoko to his home. They stayed up all night making experimental recordings, strange discordant sounds that John would later release as unfinished music number 1, Two Virgins. The album cover featured John and Yoko completely naked. When George Martin saw the cover, he was stunned. I thought, what is John doing? This wasn't rebellion, this was self-destruction. But the album cover was nothing compared to what came next. September 1968, Abbey Road Studios. The Beatles were recording what would become the White Album. The sessions were tense. George was tired of being the junior partner. Ringo briefly quit. Paul and John were barely speaking, and then John brought Yoko to the session. The Beatles had an unspoken rule: no wives, no girlfriends in the studio. This was their space, their sanctuary. Paul didn't bring Jane. George didn't bring Pattie. Ringo didn't bring Maureen. But John brought Yoko, and not just to observe. She sat next to him, whispered in his ear, and even offered musical suggestions. Paul McCartney later recalled, "It was terrible. We'd go to record and there's a woman sitting on the speaker. We couldn't say anything because it was John's girlfriend, but it changed everything. The four of us had been the unit. Now we were three, plus John and Yoko." George Harrison was more direct. "The Beatles had been the four of us for so long. We had girlfriends and wives, but when we were working, we were working. Nobody's missus was sitting in the studio with us. It was off limits. Until it wasn't." Yoko's presence didn't just break protocol, it broke the chemistry. The Beatles had always worked through disagreements because they were in it together, 4 equal partners. But John didn't see 4 equal partners anymore. He saw 3 people trying to hold him back from his true artistic calling, and 1 woman who understood him. During the White Album sessions, John became increasingly erratic. He was using heroin, which he later admitted was an escape from the pressure. His songwriting shifted. While Paul wrote Obla Di, Obla Da, and Blackbird, John wrote Happiness is a Warm Gun and Revolution 9, a chaotic 8-minute sound collage that the other Beatles openly hated. "What the heck is that?" Paul reportedly said when he first heard Revolution 9. "It's art," John replied. "But you wouldn't understand art, would you, Paul? You're too busy writing granny music." This was the new John. Dismissive, combative, convinced that his avant-garde experiments with Yoko were more important than anything the Beatles could create together. But the real breaking point wasn't the music. It was the message John was sending. Yoko matters more than you do. In January 1969, the Beatles attempted one final project to recapture their magic: the Get Back sessions. The idea was simple: go back to their roots, play live, and remember why they started making music in the first place. Instead, they captured on film the exact moment the Beatles died. January 2nd, 1969. Twickenham Film Studios, London. The cameras rolled as the Beatles gathered to rehearse for what would become their final album. Director Michael Lindsay Hogg was there to document their creative process. Instead, he documented a murder. From day one, the tension was unbearable. John arrived late, often by hours, with Yoko permanently attached to his side, not sitting in the background but literally next to him, sometimes between him and Paul. George Martin later said, "It was like having a fifth Beatle, except this fifth Beatle didn't play anything, and nobody wanted her there." Paul, trying to hold the project together, would suggest arrangements, chord progressions, or song structures. John, sitting with Yoko, would either ignore him or openly mock him. In one devastating exchange caught on camera, Paul suggests a guitar part for Get Back. 3 days later, on January 10th, George Harrison quit the Beatles. "See you around the clubs," he said, and walked out. The cameras captured John's reaction, a slight smirk. Not concern, not alarm, satisfaction. Because George leaving meant one less person questioning his authority, one less person making him feel like he wasn't the most important person in the room. George returned a week later, but only after Paul literally begged him. The compromise? They'd move the sessions from the cold, miserable Twickenham studios to their own Apple studios, and they'd abandoned the live performance idea. It was supposed to make things better. It didn't. At Apple Studios, Yoko's presence became even more intrusive. She sat on the amplifier directly next to John. She whispered continuously in his ear. And in one moment that symbolized the entire collapse, she literally ate George Harrison's biscuits that had been specifically brought in for George. George later recalled with bitter humor, "It sounds silly, but it was symptomatic of the whole situation. Everything that was ours was now John and Yoko's. Our space, our sessions, even our bloody biscuits." But food wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that John had mentally left the Beatles. During the Get Back sessions, John would work on Beatles songs with one hand and hold Yoko's hand with the other, literally. When Paul tried to collaborate on Don't Let Me Down, John turned it into a song about Yoko. When they rehearsed I've Got a Feeling, John would look at Yoko, not at his bandmates. Glyn Johns, the engineer, remembered John wasn't present. Physically, yes. Mentally, he was somewhere else entirely, and that somewhere else was wherever Yoko was. The most damning moment came when they were discussing their future. Paul, ever the optimist, suggested they could still tour small clubs, reconnect with live audiences, remember why they loved playing together. John's response caught on tape. "I just want to do my own thing now. I'm not interested in being a Beatle anymore." Paul stared at him. George looked at the floor. Ringo kept drumming softly, pretending not to hear. But it wasn't just that John wanted to move on. Every artist evolves. It was how he was moving on. With contempt. With dismissal. With the clear message that the Beatles were beneath him now. In interviews during this period, John began openly criticizing Paul's songs. He called Let It Be Paul's granny music shit. He told a reporter that Yesterday was not a Beatles song, it was just Paul.
I'm pleased that everybody's doing well. You know, I'm more pleased that Ringo's doing well. You know, that he's got himself a good niche. Because I knew Paul would be all right. What the hell am I worried about him? You know, I know he's going to be all right.
When the audience has certain favorites, maybe they like Paul more than they like John or something like that. And I wonder, I got right to it, didn't I? Yeah. I just wondered if it's awfully difficult to be friends, and do you really care about whether or not you're friends when you are a group such as the Beatles, whether you're the Rolling Stones or whoever?
We didn't break up because we weren't friends. We just broke up out of sheer boredom, you know. And boredom creates tension.
How can you get bored doing what you did?
Because it was going on, it was not going anywhere, you know. We'd stop touring, and we'd just sort of say, time to make an album, you know, go in the studio, and the same four of us would be looking at each other and playing the same licks. There's always a chance we'd work together because, you know, if we see each other, we tend to fall into that kind of mood. But I can't see us touring or anything like that. We've never discussed it. I could see us making records, you know, why not? But that touring bit, I don't quite fancy that myself.
You mentioned that earlier about things with the Beatles being settled. Has everything been settled, or are there still things?
It's like a big family, you know, and the body of the Beatles died, and there's this sort of will with all these different angles to it that people are trying to sort out. It's like an estate was left and somebody died, and we're the sons that have got to try and sort it out. Nobody knows what they're doing. But I think we're finally coming through with that.
When someone praised Hey Jude, John corrected them. It's a commercial song, not an artistic one. This was the man who had once called Paul the greatest bass player and melody writer in the world. The final Beatles recording session took place on August 20th, 1969. They were putting finishing touches on I Want You, She's So Heavy, a song John wrote about Yoko that featured John screaming her name over and over while feedback droned for nearly 8 minutes. At 2:20 p.m., John said, "Cut it there." The tape was sliced mid-note. The song ends abruptly, violently, as if someone just pulled the plug. "That's it," John said. And he walked out. None of them knew it then, but the Beatles had just recorded their last song together. And true to form, John made it about Yoko. made it abrasive, made it impossible to listen to casually, and made it end in the most jarring way possible. Because if John Lennon couldn't have the Beatles on his terms, if he couldn't be the undisputed leader, the primary genius, the most important voice, then he would rather destroy them. September 20th, 1969. A private meeting at Apple Corps. John Lennon had invited his bandmates to discuss the band's future. What they got was an execution. "I want a divorce," John said flatly. Paul, George, and Ringo stared at him. From the Beatles, "I'm leaving. I've been wanting to tell you, but I didn't know how." Paul was devastated. George seemed relieved. Ringo remained silent. But here's where John's ego did something truly remarkable. He agreed to keep his decision secret. Why? Because Alan Klein, their new manager, was negotiating a lucrative record deal, and announcing the breakup would hurt their leverage. So John stayed quiet for 6 months. 6 months during which Paul, unaware of John's public intentions, tried to save the band. 6 months during which Paul worked on bringing everyone together. 6 months during which Paul believed they could still salvage something. And then, on April 10th, 1970, Paul McCartney released a press statement with his solo album, McCartney. "I have no plans to work with the Beatles again." The media exploded. "Paul breaks up the Beatles," screamed the headlines. John was furious. Not because the Beatles had broken up. He'd already decided that 9 months ago. He was furious because Paul got to announce it. Paul got to be the one who made the decision public. Paul got the attention. In a seething interview with Rolling Stone in December 1970, John unleashed everything he'd been holding back. The Beatles broke up because we couldn't stand being together anymore, but mostly because of Paul's ego. He wanted to be the leader, and we didn't want to be led by him. "Wait, Paul's ego?" The journalist pushed back. "But didn't you leave first?" John doubled down. "I left because I was being stifled. Paul was trying to control everything. He treated George like a session musician, and me like I was just there to back up his songs." This was revisionist history at its finest. It wasn't Paul who brought a non-musician into the studio. It wasn't Paul who arrived hours late. It wasn't Paul who said, "I'm not interested in being a Beatle anymore." But in John's mind, he was the victim. The Rolling Stone interview got worse. John systematically went through Beatles songs and diminished Paul's contributions. "Penny Lane? Okay, but gimmicky." "Let It Be? Gospel trash." "The Long and Winding Road? Paul's worst." When the interviewer mentioned that "Yesterday" was the most covered song ever, John scoffed. "So what? McDonald's sells more hamburgers than anyone else. Does that make them the best?" He even went after George Martin, the producer who had turned their rough ideas into masterpieces. "George Martin was more helpful to Paul than to me. Paul speaks that language, orchestras and all that. I'm more into raw, honest music." But the most revealing statement came when the interviewer asked about Yoko's influence. "Yoko didn't break up the Beatles broke themselves up. But Yoko showed me I didn't need them. She showed me I was John Lennon, not just a Beatle. And that threatened Paul because he knew he was just Paul McCartney from the Beatles. Without the band, he's nothing." There it was. The core of John's ego laid bare. He believed Paul needed the Beatles more than he did. He believed he was the genius and Paul was the lucky one. He believed that history would remember him as the artist and Paul as the pop star. And so, in interview after interview throughout the 1970s, John rewrote history. He claimed he'd written the majority of Lennon-McCartney songs. He hadn't. He claimed Paul had contributed little to his masterpieces. Paul had written entire sections of A Day in the Life. He claimed the Beatles would have been nothing without him. They sold 183 million records in the US alone. Paul, devastated and depressed, retreated to his farm in Scotland. George released All Things Must Pass and barely mentioned John. Ringo stayed out of it. But the damage was done. John's ego hadn't just destroyed the Beatles, it had poisoned their legacy. Here's the cruelest irony of John Lennon's ego. He was right. He was a genius. His songwriting was revolutionary. His artistic vision did change music. Songs like Imagine, Strawberry Fields Forever, and A Day in the Life are timeless masterpieces that prove his brilliance beyond any doubt. But he was also wrong. because Paul McCartney was a genius too, and together they created something neither could replicate alone. John's solo career produced incredible work. Imagine, instant karma, mind games, but it also produced forgettable albums, self-indulgent experiments, and songs that even his most devoted fans skip. Without Paul's commercial instinct to balance his experimental edge, without George Martin's production to polish his raw ideas, without the structure of the Beatles to focus his creativity, John drifted, and he knew it. In 1980, just months before his death, John gave an interview to Playboy magazine. The anger had softened, the bitterness had faded, and for the first time in a decade, he spoke honestly about the Beatles. It was the most honest John had been since 1957, when he swallowed his pride and invited Paul to join the Quarrymen. When asked if he'd ever work with Paul again, John smiled. "I'd like to. I think we could make something beautiful. But first, I'd have to apologize. And you know me, I'm shit at apologies." He never got the chance. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was murdered outside the Dakota Building in New York City. He was 40 years old. Paul McCartney, when told of John's death, could only say, "It's a drag, isn't it?"
I was very shocked, It's terrible news.
How did you find out about it?
I got a phone call this morning.
From whom?
From a friend of mine.
Are you planning to go before the funeral?
I don't know yet.
Have you discussed the death with any of the other Beatles?
No.
Do you plan to?
Probably, yeah.
What were you recording today?
I was just listening to some stuff, I just didn't want to sit at home.
Why?
Oh, I didn't feel like it.
What time did you hear the news?
This morning sometime.
Very early?
Yeah. Go now, yeah? Drag, isn't it? Okay, cheers. Bye.
Bye, guys.
A drag isn't how the world will see it, nor can there ever be any more talk of the Beatles getting together again.
Later in private, he broke down, not just for the loss of his friend, but for the loss of what they could have been, for the reunion that would never happen, for the apology he'd never receive. John Lennon didn't destroy the Beatles with drugs or money or creative differences. He destroyed them because he couldn't share the spotlight, because his ego demanded that he be the singular genius, the unquestioned leader, the most important voice in the room. And when the reality didn't match his self-image, when Paul's melodies got more acclaim, when George found his own voice, when Ringo's steady drumming held everything together without needing credit, John chose destruction over collaboration. The greatest creative partnership in music history ended not with a bang, but with one man's inability to say three simple words: "We're better together."